It was the evening of September 26, 1983, when the vast steppe outside Moscow lay wrapped in early autumn haze and the Soviet Union's most secret compound hummed under fluorescent light. Inside the Sepukov 15 Command Center, the heart of the Soviet early warning system, rows of officers watched the silent glow of radar screens that pulsed like distant heartbeats. The Cold War had entered its most perilous phase. NATO was preparing for new missile deployments in Europe, and both superpowers stood one nervous signal away from catastrophe. Every man in that bunker knew that if an alert came, they would have barely minutes to confirm or deny the end of the world. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat in the monitoring chair, surrounded by the low murmur of machines and the faint smell of heated circuitry. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension, a mixture that had become routine for men trained to interpret the difference between life and annihilation. Outside those reinforced walls, ordinary citizens slept in Moscow apartments, unaware that invisible satellites hovered above them, waiting for the faint flare of a missile leaving American soil. In the logic of nuclear deterrence, hesitation was weakness, response had to be instant, absolute, and unquestioning. Shortly after midnight, the calm rhythm of the shift fractured. A shrill alarm erupted from the Oko satellite console, slicing through the silence like a blade. Red lights strobed across the control panels, and on the main screen a single word appeared in blinding Cyrillic: launch. The system reported that an American Minuteman missile had been fired from a base in North Dakota, its trajectory arcing towards Soviet territory. In an instant, the bunker became a storm of motion, chairs scraping, phones lifted, officers shouting into headsets. Protocol demanded that Petrov relay the alert to the General Staff immediately. Once confirmed, the Kremlin would have only minutes to order a counter-strike. He froze for a fraction of a second, mind racing through the possibilities. Could the Americans truly have launched a first strike, one missile, alone? It made no sense. Training told him to trust the computer, but instinct told him something was wrong. Then another alarm sounded, then another, 5 missiles now, each tracked by the satellite's infrared sensors. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of those red lights, each one a potential trigger for Armageddon. Petrov could almost feel the breath of history on his neck. The men around him looked for orders. The communications officer clutched the phone that would connect them to the Soviet High Command, waiting for Petrov's word. Sweat gathered under his uniform collar, the hum of the air filters grew louder than thought. In those seconds, every theory of deterrence, every speech about national honor, collapsed into a single human dilemma: believe the machine, or believe intuition. If he reported attack confirmed, nuclear retaliation would be set in motion, hundreds of missiles launched in reply, millions dead before dawn. If he dismissed it and was wrong, the Soviet Union would face annihilation without defense. He glanced again at the display. The readings were clean, too clean, 5 perfect launches, equally spaced, identical in intensity. Real launches were rarely that neat. Petrov leaned forward, voice steady but thin. "System malfunction," he said quietly. "This is a false alarm." Around him, disbelief flickered. No one dared argue. He wrote the words in the duty log, his pen shaking slightly, and ordered the alert downgraded. For 23 endless minutes the world hung in suspension, waiting to learn whether he had just saved it or doomed it. Gradually, the radar network reported no incoming warheads, no detonations, no seismic shock. The screens returned to green. The alarm silenced one by one until only the hum of the ventilation remained. Petrov exhaled and stared at his reflection in the dark glass of the monitor, an ordinary man in a moment history would never have forgiven him for misunderstanding. Above the steppe, The sky remained quiet, its stars indifferent to the crisis that had almost erased humanity. Outside the bunker, dawn was beginning to color the horizon over Moscow, pale and cold. Inside, no one spoke. The officers went through the motions of protocol, filing reports, noting times, pretending nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet every man knew the truth, that on this anonymous night, the planet had come within a single keystroke of nuclear war, and only one man's doubt had stood between civilization and silence. To understand the weight of that night, one must return to the fevered pulse of the early 1980s, when the Cold War had ceased to be a distant standoff and had become a living, breathing paranoia. The détente of the 1970s was over, swept away by Afghanistan, boycotts, and speeches that spoke openly of evil empires. Both Washington and Moscow had entered a technological arms race not of quantity but of speed, each side building systems that could sense, decide, and strike faster than any human hand. The skies glittered with satellites, the oceans churned with submarines whose cargo could erase continents. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction had long since ceased to terrify. It had become routine, an accepted madness wrapped in bureaucracy. In the Kremlin, old men who had survived Stalin and the Great Patriotic War now commanded arsenals capable of burning the earth several times over. To them, the Americans were unpredictable idealists, waving flags of freedom while deploying first-strike missiles in Western Europe. In Washington, the Soviets were seen as paranoid autocrats, convinced that every training exercise concealed an invasion. Between them hung a fragile thread of communication, a hotline that might, if luck permitted, buy 10 minutes of understanding before the world turned white. By 1983, the thread was fraying. President Reagan had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to build a shield against Soviet missiles that Moscow interpreted as preparation for a surprise attack. NATO had begun deploying Pershing II and cruise missiles across West Germany and Britain, cutting warning times from half an hour to barely 6 minutes. Soviet intelligence agencies, haunted by memories of Hitler's 1941 invasion, searched feverishly for signs that history would repeat itself from the West. Every signal, every radar blip, every intercepted phrase was filtered through the fear that the Americans might strike first. The Soviet military's early warning network was built to counter that fear. Named OKO, it consisted of satellites stationed high above the equator, watching for the heat flare of intercontinental missile launches. It was the crown jewel of Soviet deterrence, a marvel of Cold War engineering that combined orbital sensors with ground-based radars buried deep within secure command centers like Sepukov 15. Yet for all its complexity, the system depended on something painfully fragile: human judgment. Machines could detect light, but only men could decide what that light meant. In Washington, a similar machine logic guided the U.S. Strategic Command. Thousands of miles away, beneath the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, American officers watched their own arrays of screens, waiting for a signal from Moscow that would never come. The idea that one false reading or a single misinterpreted blip could spark Armageddon was well known, and quietly accepted as the price of deterrence. Both sides told themselves the system worked because it had to. Tension that year had reached a boiling point. In September 1983, just 3 weeks before Petrov's night of decision, a Soviet fighter jet had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted airspace, killing 269 civilians, including a U.S. congressman. Washington called it barbarism. Moscow insisted it was a provocation. The world recoiled, but inside the Kremlin, the mood turned darker. Soviet leadership began to suspect that the West was preparing a coordinated strike disguised as diplomacy. Intelligence services were ordered to anticipate a decapitating first strike. The atmosphere within Soviet defense circles became one of permanent alert. In such a climate, trust was extinct. Officers like Petrov did not merely serve machines, they served a doctrine that demanded suspicion of everything, even of one's own instincts. The daily drills, the endless procedures, the rigid hierarchies were all designed to erase hesitation. And yet, hesitation was precisely what had saved the world. The irony of the Cold War was that both superpowers, in their quest for control, had built systems too complex for certainty. A reflection of sunlight, a stray cloud pattern, a software glitch, any of these could mimic the heat signature of a missile launch. And in the rigid logic of deterrence, even one error could cascade into extinction. This was the unspoken truth of the nuclear balance. The peace of the world rested not on courage or diplomacy, but on the fragile sanity of a few overworked men staring at screens in the dark. That night in 1983 was no accident of fate, it was the natural outcome of a world that had learned to live beside the abyss. And as Petrov sat in that bunker, staring at a red word that demanded obedience, he was not just confronting a false alarm, he was confronting the logic of the entire age. In the long corridors of the Soviet defense establishment, men like Stanislav Petrov were ghosts in uniform, invisible guardians of a world that could never thank them. They lived in secrecy, stationed inside concrete fortresses with no windows, no sunlight, and no names allowed to leave the wire. Their task was simple to describe but unbearable to execute: watch for signs of the apocalypse, verify them, and, if confirmed, set in motion the destruction of the earth. It was a duty that required precision, obedience, and the ability to remain calm when every human instinct screamed to run. Petrov had not sought glory. Born in Vladivostok in 1939, he had grown up in the shadow of war, the son of a fighter pilot who had battled the Luftwaffe. His mother, a nurse, had tended the wounded in a world where heroism was measured in survival. When he joined the Air Defense Forces, he was neither a party loyalist nor a cynic. He was a technician, a quiet, intelligent officer who believed in the rationality of systems, in mathematics, in the notion that machines could keep peace better than politicians. Yet deep down, he also knew that machines could lie. The men of Sepukov 15 worked 12-hour shifts in perpetual twilight. They arrived in buses that passed through multiple gates and checkpoints, each man surrendering his identification and stepping into a realm where time blurred. Inside, there was only the hum of computers, the rhythm of typed codes, and the soft click of pens recording the end of the world that never came. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They did not march or fight. They sat and waited. Waiting was their battlefield. Across the ocean, in places like Cheyenne Mountain and Orford Air Force Base, their American counterparts lived the same strange existence. Young men and women in starched uniforms sat before glowing monitors, watching for blips on screens that could turn into mushroom clouds. Their job titles were sterile: missile warning officers, data analysts, communication specialists, yet their hands rested only a few steps removed from doomsday. For them too, routine was everything. Routine was what kept panic away. Despite the symmetry of fear, the two sides viewed each other as mirror opposites. The Soviets believed the Americans were reckless gamblers, obsessed with technological dominance and blind faith in computers. The Americans saw the Soviets as rigid, humorless bureaucrats whose devotion to procedure would doom them in a crisis. Neither side realized how similar they were, both trapped by the same logic, both praying that the other would not mistake vigilance for aggression. Inside Sepukov 15, life followed a precise choreography. Officers rotated through duty stations, signed endless logs, and tested the alert system every hour. Meals were brief and tasteless, sleep came in metal bunks stacked like coffins. They lived underground for days at a time, emerging pale and blinking into the cold morning light when their shifts ended. Yet even in monotony, camaraderie formed, the quiet jokes, the shared cigarettes, the unspoken trust that if disaster came, each man would do his duty without question. Petrov's colleagues respected him but found him peculiar. He was less mechanical than most, more inclined to question the logic of the system, to look for flaws where others saw perfection. He once remarked to a fellow officer that a computer is only as reliable as the man who built it, a comment that earned him a reprimand for defeatist thinking. But that same skepticism, that unwillingness to treat a blinking light as divine truth, would one day become his salvation. For the Soviet Union, men like Petrov were replaceable parts in a vast machine of deterrence. Promotions were rare, errors unforgivable, and emotional expression frowned upon. The officers' families knew only that they worked in communications, and questions were never asked. Their pay was steady, their loyalty assumed, their humanity quietly suppressed beneath layers of secrecy. The irony was that the fate of the world rested on individuals who were trained not to think of themselves as individuals at all. Each night, as they descended into the bunker, the men of Sepukov 15 left behind the ordinary world, wives, children, the smell of pine after rain, and entered a parallel reality built on tension and restraint. Here, emotion was danger, curiosity was suspicion, and hesitation was treason. But somewhere beneath that discipline, every man carried the same silent fear that one night, the alarms would not stop, and they would become the instruments of humanity's final act. That fear, unspoken yet omnipresent, was the true pulse of the Cold War. It did not belong to generals or presidents, but to those who sat alone in the glow of their machines, the men who stared into screens and prayed that nothing ever appeared. And among them, one officer's skepticism would soon collide with the most dangerous false signal in history. The autumn of 1983 carried an unease that could be felt even through the walls of embassies and listening posts. It was a year when drills began to look too much like the real thing, when war games blurred into rehearsals for catastrophe. NATO's exercise season had always been a familiar pattern: coded messages, simulated alerts, mock troop movements. Yet that year, something was different. Beneath the surface of procedure, both sides had begun to suspect that the other was hiding intent behind routine. To the West, it was deterrence. To Moscow, it was deception. The operation that fed this paranoia was codenamed Able Archer 83, though in Soviet intelligence cables it became known under another term whispered with dread: Vigilant Shield. It was designed to test NATO's ability to transition from conventional defense to nuclear release, a bureaucratic phrase masking a chilling scenario. For 10 days in November, Allied forces would simulate the process of escalating to nuclear war, complete with encrypted communications, high-level government participation, and realistic command protocols. What made it unique, and so dangerous, was its authenticity. Messages were transmitted as if genuine, the timelines mirrored reality, even heads of state were expected to take part. For observers watching from the other side of the Iron Curtain, the difference between simulation and prelude was nearly impossible to see. In Moscow, the KGB's residentures in Western capitals began sending anxious reports. To them, Able Archer looked like the first stage of a decapitation strike, a carefully disguised rehearsal for a surprise nuclear attack. Memories of Operation Barbarossa, when Nazi Germany had launched its invasion under the cover of routine troop maneuvers, still haunted the Soviet mind. The Politburo's aging leaders, steeped in wartime trauma, saw patterns everywhere. Their intelligence services had already been ordered to monitor signs of Western mobilization under a program called Ryan, short for nuclear missile attack. every Western exercise was now filtered through that lens of suspicion. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet forces quietly raised their alert status. Strategic bomber units in Poland and East Germany were placed on standby. The Fourth Air Army was ordered to prepare nuclear-capable aircraft for immediate readiness. In the Arctic, submarines carrying ballistic missiles received coded instructions to maintain launch readiness but remain undetected. None of these measures were announced, but American reconnaissance satellites later revealed an unmistakable pattern, a silent tightening of the Soviet military machine, as if the entire Eastern Bloc were holding its breath. Inside NATO command centers, however, few imagined the danger. To Western planners, Able Archer was just another test, a demonstration of procedural discipline after years of stagnation. Most officers involved had no idea that their simulated message traffic was triggering panic inside the Kremlin. When Western intelligence analysts finally noticed increased Soviet readiness, they dismissed it as coincidence, seasonal maneuvers, perhaps a response to internal drills. No one suspected that Moscow genuinely believed nuclear war might begin that week. In the Sepukov 15 complex, where Petrov and his colleagues rotated through their shifts, the tension was palpable even before the exercise began. Intelligence summaries filtered down through classified briefings. The West was active, satellites showed unusual communications, and command was to expect increased vigilance. No one used the word war, but the silence around it was louder than any siren. For officers like Petrov, every light on the console seemed sharper, every routine message edged with significance. They knew that one false interpretation could turn drills into disaster. When Able Archer reached its climax on November 8, Soviet listening posts reported what appeared to be the mobilization of NATO nuclear forces, exactly the scenario the Politburo had feared. Encrypted messages referenced nuclear release procedures and transition to DEFCON 1. To Soviet ears, these were not signals of play acting but of war in motion. Reports raced up the chain of command until they reached the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The response was immediate and chilling. Soviet strategic rocket forces were placed on heightened alert, crews ordered to stand by in their underground silos, awaiting the final command. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, Able Archer ended. NATO concluded its simulation, packed away its papers, and declared the exercise a success. In the West, no one noticed that for several days, the world had balanced on the edge of annihilation. In the East, relief mingled with disbelief. The Kremlin quietly lowered its alert levels, but the shock lingered. The lesson was clear: the margin between perception and destruction was now measured in misread signals. For the officers of the Soviet early warning system, that lesson was not theoretical. It would soon be tested again, in a moment that came without drills, without context, without warning. A night when the line between simulation and reality would vanish, and one man's judgment would decide whether history continued or ended in light. It began without warning, not with the roar of engines or the flash of light, but with a quiet chime that rose above the hum of machinery. Inside the sealed concrete of Sepukov 15, where night was eternal and air smelled faintly of metal and ozone, the alarm sounded like a summons from the heavens. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov looked up from his logbook, his pen halting mid-stroke, as the red indicator light flared across the central console. The satellite network had detected a launch. Somewhere, far beyond the curvature of the Earth, one of the OCO early warning satellites had seen a plume of heat that matched the signature of an intercontinental ballistic missile leaving an American silo. The room froze. Officers turned toward Petrov, waiting for confirmation. The computer screens updated with cold precision, coordinates, velocity, projected impact time. In less than 25 minutes, if the data were correct, a nuclear warhead would strike Soviet soil. Petrov's headset crackled with the voice of the duty communications officer, urgent, clipped, rehearsed. "Sir, single launch detected. Awaiting your verification." The words echoed against the reinforced walls. For a moment, Petrov did not move. His mind sifted through training protocols, the endless drills that had prepared him to act without hesitation. Yet he hesitated all the same. On the surface, it seemed simple. A missile had been launched, the system's duty officer must confirm and report to the General Staff, who would in turn alert the Kremlin. From there, within minutes, a retaliatory strike could be ordered. It was the logic of deterrence reduced to a formula. But something about that formula felt wrong. Petrov had studied the American nuclear strategy for years. He knew that a true first strike would never begin with a single missile. The Americans would launch hundreds, perhaps thousands, to ensure decapitation. One missile was not war, it was noise. Then, before he could finish his thought, the system screamed again. A second missile. Then a third. Each alert more insistent than the last, the computer's voice cold and absolute, launch detected. Confidence level, high. The main display filled with 5 bright arcs rising from North America toward the Soviet Union. Officers whispered, some cursed, others reached instinctively for procedure manuals as if words could shield them from what was coming. Petrov's pulse thudded in his ears. He felt the weight of every eye in the room turning toward him, the man who had to decide whether these signals meant Armageddon. He leaned closer to the console, studying the data as though it might confess its deceit. The readings were unnaturally symmetrical, identical trajectories, identical heat signatures, identical timing. No error codes, no irregularities. Perfect, and therefore suspicious. Real launches carried imperfections, atmospheric distortion, sensor delay, variations in intensity. This looked like something a machine had drawn rather than something nature had made. Outside, far above the atmosphere, the satellite known as Cosmos 1382 orbited in silence. Its infrared sensors scanned the dark curve of Earth, seeking the telltale flicker of rocket exhaust against the cool background of cloud and ocean. It had been launched only months earlier, a new generation of detection technology meant to shorten reaction times. Its electronic eye could spot a flame no larger than a pinhead from thousands of kilometers away. But that night, its vision was deceived, not by missiles, but by sunlight. The alignment of the Earth, the satellite, and high-altitude clouds over the American Midwest created a perfect illusion, sunlight reflecting off cloud tops at just the right angle to mimic the heat bloom of a missile launch. Petrov could not know this yet. All he had were numbers and instincts. He looked across the room, saw the fear in his subordinates' faces, men trained to obey, not to think. He realized that once he passed this information upward, it would move too fast to stop. The Kremlin's protocols allowed no second guessing. The General Staff would assume the worst, the retaliation would be automatic. Within minutes, Soviet missiles would rise from their silos, submarines would surface, and the world would vanish beneath fire. He rubbed his temples, forcing himself to breathe. His training told him to trust the system. His humanity told him not to. In that unbearable silence between alarms, he remembered his father, a pilot who had once said that machines obey, but they do not care. That sentence returned to him like a whisper through the static. Finally, he turned to the communications officer and said, softly but firmly, "Tell command, it is a false alarm." The officer blinked, uncertain. Petrov repeated the order. False alarm. Do not confirm launch. The decision hung in the air like a physical thing. For 23 minutes, the bunker existed between worlds, one in which war had begun, and another in which it had not. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the alert ceased. The satellite's readings leveled out, the screens returned to normal. No missiles had crossed the sky. No detonations followed. Only silence remained. When the shift finally ended, Petrov left the bunker and stepped into the dawn. The air outside was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of pine. Somewhere in the distance, birds were beginning to wake. He looked up at the pale horizon, unable to shake the thought that he might have just saved the world, and that no one would ever know. When dawn broke over Moscow on September 27, 1983, the world looked the same. Traffic moved, factories smoked, children walked to school, but inside the man who had kept it alive, something had changed forever. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, 34 years old, sat in silence at his desk in the debriefing room of Sepukov 15. The adrenaline had drained from his body, leaving a hollow exhaustion that felt heavier than fear. His uniform still smelled faintly of ozone and sweat. His hands trembled each time he reached for his cup of tea. On the surface he was calm, the image of an officer after a long night's duty, but beneath the quiet his thoughts spiraled endlessly around a single truth: he had disobeyed the machine. The debriefing was formal, detached, and cold. Senior officers from the Air Defense Command filed into the room with notebooks and clipped voices. They questioned him about every second of the incident, the sequence of alerts, the decisions he made, the data he reviewed. Each answer he gave felt like walking through a minefield. Officially, he had followed procedure only up to a point. By refusing to confirm the satellite's readings, he had broken the chain of command. Yet the same officers questioning him understood what might have happened if he hadn't. They listened in silence, wrote their notes, and avoided eye contact. No one dared to call it heroism. When the session ended, Petrov was ordered not to discuss the event. The incident would remain classified under the highest secrecy, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. There would be no medals, no recognition, no acknowledgement that a single man's doubt had prevented a nuclear war. Instead, his superiors quietly reprimanded him for improper documentation of the event, a convenient administrative punishment that allowed the system to save face without admitting how close it had come to disaster. He was transferred soon after, given lighter duties under the pretext of rest. His career stalled, promotions evaporated. For the Soviet military, the system had to remain infallible. To admit that an officer's intuition had triumphed over technology would mean admitting the fallibility of the state itself. Petrov understood this, but the understanding brought him little comfort. At night, he found it difficult to sleep. In his dreams, alarms blared endlessly, the word launch flashed red behind his eyelids. Sometimes he woke in panic, his heart pounding as if the war had begun after all. At home, his wife, Raisa, noticed the change. She had married a quiet, methodical man who loved mathematics and tinkering with radios. After that September night, he grew distant, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes irritable without reason. When she asked about his work, he simply shook his head. Nothing happened, he would say, though the look in his eyes betrayed him. They lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, their walls thin, their life modest. His salary barely covered the essentials. Yet even in obscurity, Petrov carried the unbearable weight of knowing how fragile everything was. Years passed, and the world outside shifted. The Soviet Union began to crumble under its own contradictions. Afghanistan, Chernobyl, reform, collapse. Petrov retired early, his file sealed, his service forgotten. Occasionally, he would read about new satellite systems, new early warning technologies, each promising greater accuracy, greater safety. He would smile faintly at the headlines and mutter to himself, "Machines will always see what they want to see." It was not until a decade later, in the mid-1990s, that the truth of that night began to surface. A retired Soviet general, interviewed by a Western journalist, mentioned an incident in which a single officer had prevented a catastrophic launch. The story spread quietly through defense circles until it reached the press. Reporters tracked down Petrov in his small apartment, now a widower after Reisa's death from cancer. They found a man thin, weary, but articulate, still haunted, yet calm. When asked how he felt about being called the man who saved the world, he simply shrugged. "I was just doing my job," he said. "I had a feeling that if there was a real attack, it would look different." For the first time, Western audiences heard his name. Documentaries were made, awards followed, the World Citizen Award, the Dresden Peace Prize. Yet the recognition came too late to change his life. Petrov lived modestly until his death in 2017, alone in his small flat, the heroism of his decision reduced to a line in the footnotes of Cold War history. But to those who studied nuclear deterrence, his name became a symbol of something larger, the fragile intersection between human judgment and machine certainty. In a world governed by binary logic, Petrov had chosen ambiguity. Where others would have obeyed, he had doubted. That doubt, small and human, was what kept the sky from burning. The moment began as a tremor, barely perceptible, the flicker of a cursor, the shrill crack of an alarm that snapped through the bunker like a gunshot. In an instant, the quiet hum of Sepukov 15 dissolved into chaos. Red warning lamps pulsed against the steel walls, bathing the room in rhythmic flashes of crimson. A computer voice, calm and synthetic, repeated the same words in an endless loop. "Launch detected. Launch detected." The temperature seemed to rise by degrees with every repetition, though the air remained cold. It was September 26, 1983, a date that would never appear in any official record, yet lived on in the memory of the man who refused to start a war. Petrov's hand froze above the keyboard. His eyes darted between screens filled with data, altitude vectors, trajectory arcs, impact estimates. Everything in front of him screamed certainty. 5 missiles, all American, all inbound. The system rated its confidence level at 100%. Around him, subordinates spoke in clipped, nervous bursts. "Comrade Colonel, confirmation request pending. Link established with the General Staff." The sound of typing, paper shifting, and hurried footsteps merged into an overwhelming blur. The bunker's air filters hummed with mechanical indifference, as though mocking the terror of the humans it kept alive. Protocol dictated that Petrov report the data immediately. He would use the phrase "missile attack warning," a sentence that, once spoken, would race through secure lines to Moscow's command hierarchy. Within 2 minutes, it would reach the desks of men whose fingers rested over the nuclear launch keys. That phrase, those 3 words, would trigger the unthinkable. He knew the routine too well: confirmation, escalation, retaliation. The sequence had been drilled into him 100 times, and each drill had ended the same way, with the comforting announcement, "Exercise concluded." But tonight, there was no conclusion, no reassurance, only the endless red glow of alarms reflecting off sweating faces. He tried to steady his breathing. He had to think, to see past the noise. The logic was wrong. The Americans would never begin a nuclear war with only 5 missiles. The entire strategy of first strike depended on overwhelming force, hundreds of launches designed to blind and decapitate the enemy before they could respond. 5 missiles were nothing. An insult. A provocation too small to make sense. The system was either mistaken or the world had gone insane. Petrov's mind raced through possibilities. Technical error? Software malfunction? A cosmic event interfering with the satellites. The OCO system was new, untested under certain orbital conditions. He had filed reports before about false triggers caused by reflected sunlight, but they had been dismissed by engineers confident in their calculations. Now, those same engineers were silent, unreachable in their offices far from the front lines of Armageddon. "Colonel, sir, shall we confirm?" The voice came from his communications officer, a young lieutenant whose hands trembled on the telephone receiver. Behind him, 2 other officers hovered, waiting for orders that would decide the fate of millions. Petrov realized then that his voice was the only barrier left between silence and sirens, between life and extinction. He made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he exhaled and said, "Negative." False alarm. The word seemed to echo unnaturally in the stale air. For a second, no one moved. Then, uncertainty rippled across the room. The lieutenant blinked, uncertain whether to repeat what he'd heard. "Comrade Colonel, are you sure?" Petrov didn't look up. "I repeat, false alarm. Report to command, system malfunction." The room fell quiet except for the electronic whine of cooling fans. Somewhere deep within the facility, relays clicked as automated systems continued their routines, unaware that the decision had already been made. On the main display, 5 glowing lines arced toward oblivion, phantom missiles chasing an illusion across the void. Petrov stared at them as the minutes dragged on, each second an eternity. He imagined radar stations across the Soviet Union scanning the skies, finding nothing. He imagined families asleep in their apartments, unaware of the narrowness of their salvation. At 12 minutes past midnight, the first predicted impact time passed. No explosions. No shockwaves. The Earth continued its slow rotation beneath the indifferent stars. The computers recalculated, searching for new data, and then, without ceremony, the alert vanished. The screen went dark. Petrov leaned back in his chair, the muscles in his shoulders burning from tension. His breath came shallow and uneven, his throat dry. The men around him exhaled almost in unison, like divers surfacing after too long underwater. Someone whispered a prayer, someone else began to cry quietly. The danger had passed, but no one could quite believe it. For 23 minutes, the world had stood poised on the edge of annihilation. 23 minutes in which one man's doubt had outweighed a superpower's certainty. Petrov rubbed his eyes and felt the dampness of sweat at his temples. He understood, in that moment, that he could never speak of this night, not because of secrecy, but because words could not capture what it meant to stand between existence and extinction. Outside, the night sky over Moscow was perfectly still. The satellites continued their silent patrols, watching, measuring, ready to betray their watchers again. But for now, at least, the Earth remained intact, suspended in that thin margin of error where humanity's survival still depended on the courage of a single uncertain man. In the days that followed, the halls of the Soviet Air Defense Command echoed with the sterile language of inquiry. Reports were filed, refiled, and stamped with red seals. Engineers pored over streams of data, recalculating orbital vectors, searching for errors that could explain what the OCO satellites had seen. Somewhere in that blizzard of numbers lay the ghost of a nuclear war that almost was a phantom conjured not by malice or politics, but by the indifferent physics of sunlight and cloud. The first suspicions came from a small team at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, where the satellites had been launched months earlier. They noticed that on the night of September 26th, the sun had been positioned at a shallow angle below the horizon relative to the American Midwest. High-altitude cirrus clouds, thin as gauze but rich in ice crystals, had drifted through the region. When sunlight struck them just right, it produced a brief, intense reflection in the infrared spectrum, precisely the wavelength that the OCO satellites were designed to interpret as missile exhaust. In effect, the system had seen the dawn long before it reached the ground. But such an explanation was dangerous, even sacrilegious within the rigid hierarchies of Soviet engineering. The OCO system was the pride of the Union scientific establishment, the culmination of decades of research meant to close the so-called warning gap with the United States. To admit that it had been fooled by sunlight was to admit imperfection in a machine meant to be perfect. Meetings were convened behind closed doors, scientists debated in whispers, careful not to attach their names to conclusions that might anger superiors. Meanwhile, at Sepukov 15, Petrov's report circulated among the inner circles of command. His superiors knew the truth of what had happened, but they could not afford the humiliation of acknowledgement. Officially, the event became Incident 0909, classified as an equipment malfunction of low priority. The documentation was sealed, and orders were issued forbidding any further discussion. Petrov himself was reassigned to a training division, a quiet exile disguised as routine rotation. The system, after all, could not fail, therefore, the man who had questioned it had to. Still, whispers spread through the network of officers who had been on duty that night. Some called Petrov reckless for disobeying the protocol, others, quietly, called him brave. They understood what it meant to sit before those screens, to feel the gravity of the red word launch staring back at you, demanding faith. A few began to wonder how many other times the machines might have cried wolf, and how many times someone less skeptical might have answered. At higher levels of the Soviet government, the incident deepened an already festering paranoia. Marshal Ogarkov, the chief of the general staff, read the summary and reportedly said nothing for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and cold. If this had been real, he said, we would not be here to discuss it. The remark circulated quietly among senior officers, half warning, half confession. The illusion of control had cracked, and behind it they glimpsed chaos. Across the Atlantic, the Americans knew nothing. U.S. intelligence analysts at the National Security Agency continued their endless intercepts, their surveillance of radar frequencies and coded transmissions, unaware that one of their satellites' reflections had nearly triggered a Soviet counterstrike. The near catastrophe would remain unknown to them for more than a decade. To the outside world, late 1983 was just another season of tension, NATO drills, propaganda duels, speeches about peace and strength. The true danger had already passed, unseen, like a meteor flashing across a clouded sky. For Petrov, the aftermath was quieter but more corrosive. He returned to duty, though no one looked him directly in the eye anymore. He was neither celebrated nor condemned, merely absorbed back into the machinery he had momentarily defied. But something in him had changed. Each time the alarm system was tested, each time the console lights flickered, he felt a pulse of dread in his chest. He began to doubt not just the technology, but the entire philosophy behind it, the belief that safety could be achieved through automation, that deterrence could be entrusted to systems more rigid than the men who built them. In private moments, he wrote notes to himself in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, fragments of thought, pieces of logic he could not say aloud. If computers can decide for us, he wrote, then who decides what they mean? The question haunted him because he already knew the answer. As weeks turned to months, the official investigation concluded with bureaucratic neatness, false signal caused by anomalous solar reflection. System integrity remains uncompromised. The matter was closed, the files archived, the lessons ignored. Yet among the few who had witnessed the night of the Phantom launch, a quiet understanding took root that civilization survival had rested not on command structures or technology, but on the conscience of one man who chose not to believe his own instruments. In Moscow, the corridors of power were heavy with smoke and secrecy. Within days of the incident, coded reports reached the upper levels of the Soviet leadership, summaries stripped of emotion, couched in the language of procedure. False alarm registered. No retaliatory measures executed. Operator response, non-standard. The phrasing was careful, antiseptic, almost meaningless. Yet beneath those words lay the raw truth. For 23 minutes, the Soviet Union had stood on the brink of annihilation. The report was delivered to the General Staff in a closed session attended by senior defense officials and KGB liaisons. They gathered beneath the high ceilings of a room designed for triumphs, not confessions. The air was still, the only sound the rustle of papers and the occasional cough muffled behind a fist. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, the chief of the General Staff, read through the summary with deliberate calm. He had spent his career building the very systems that had nearly destroyed him. When he reached the final line, operator overrode automated confirmation protocol, he stopped reading and looked up. What if he hadn't? He asked. No one answered. It was not a question meant for response but for silence, the kind of silence that carried accusation and/or in equal measure. The room seemed to shrink. Those present understood what Ogarkov was implying. Had Lieutenant Colonel Petrov followed procedure as written, the Soviet response would have been immediate. Missiles would have been launched before any radar confirmation, because the system was designed to trust itself. Hundreds of warheads would have arced across the Arctic Circle toward American cities before anyone realized the error. The world would have been gone before dawn. A deputy from the Ministry of Defense cleared his throat and spoke in a careful monotone. Comrade Marshal, the officer in question acted outside of regulations. His decision may have prevented escalation, but it also undermined confidence in our early warning system. Ogarkov closed the folder, his expression unreadable. Confidence, he said, is a fragile thing. Then, almost in a whisper, perhaps too fragile to survive truth. The meeting ended without conclusion. No one suggested rewarding Petrov, no one suggested punishing him. To acknowledge either would draw attention to the incident, and attention was dangerous. The Soviet Union was already struggling under the weight of internal dissent, economic stagnation, and foreign pressure. Its leaders could not afford another narrative of weakness. The event was quietly reclassified, its files sealed in the archives of the Ministry of Defense. Only a few trusted officials were allowed to know its details, and they spoke of it rarely, if at all. Yet in private, the mood among the Kremlin's inner circle shifted. The illusion of control, that the vast machinery of deterrence could function flawlessly, was broken. Some within the Politburo began to wonder whether their own systems had grown too fast, too complex, too unmanageable. They would never say it aloud, but the thought lingered in every classified meeting: if one man's hesitation could save us, then one man's obedience could end us. And there were other worries. The Able Archer exercise had just concluded, and Soviet intelligence had warned repeatedly that NATO's activities were becoming indistinguishable from real war preparations. Combined with the false alarm, the leadership's nerves were frayed to the point of paranoia. The aging General Secretary, Yuri Andropov, already weakened by illness, reportedly asked during a briefing, "If their computers can make mistakes, why should we believe ours cannot?" It was an extraordinary statement, a rare flash of doubt from the highest office in a state built on certainty. Behind closed doors, Andropov ordered a quiet review of early warning procedures. More human oversight, he demanded, more cross-verification between satellites and ground radar. But his directives moved slowly through the bureaucratic sludge of ministries and committees. No one wanted to be responsible for redesigning a system that existed as much for prestige as for defense. In a nation obsessed with appearances, technological infallibility was propaganda. Doubt was treason. So the official position remained unchanged: the system had worked. A malfunction had been detected and resolved by established protocol. The fact that the protocol had been ignored was omitted from every report that left the Defense Ministry. In its place, the myth of Soviet perfection endured, fragile but intact. Still, in the privacy of their offices, some officials could not forget that night. A colonel in the Strategic Rocket Forces later confided to a colleague, "We came within one man of ending the world. And no one will ever admit it." The words were never written down, but they passed from mouth to mouth in quiet tones, a secret confession of mortality in a state that denied having any. Meanwhile, Petrov's name was erased from the paperwork. In the official archives, the event bore no human author. It became a line of data, a system anomaly logged and closed. Yet beyond the walls of the Kremlin, the consequences of that night continued to ripple unseen. The logic of deterrence, so long treated as sacred, had revealed its flaw. It depended not on technology or ideology, but on the unpredictable mercy of human beings. That truth frightened the Kremlin more than any enemy missile. And so, as they had done so many times before, they buried it, and not out of conspiracy, but out of fear that the world would realize how close they had come to losing everything. Across the ocean, the United States slept peacefully through the night that almost ended civilization. No radar screens flashed, no alarms sounded in Cheyenne Mountain, no frantic calls from the Pentagon disturbed the quiet of suburban Washington. To the Americans, September 26, 1983, was unremarkable, another chapter in the endless tension of the Cold War, but not a moment of crisis. The men who commanded the most powerful military on earth had no idea that their counterparts in Moscow had nearly unleashed Armageddon. The most terrifying event of the nuclear age had passed, and not a single American official knew it had even happened. In the Situation Room beneath the White House, staff analysts monitored the usual stream of satellite imagery and coded transmissions from Eastern Europe. Nothing unusual appeared. The Soviet Union's air defenses seemed calm, its missile fields quiet. American reconnaissance satellites, gliding silently above the Earth, detected no signs of panic. The night looked ordinary, and that, in its way, was the most dangerous illusion of all. At the time, the United States believed it had a near-perfect picture of Soviet readiness. The CIA and NSA maintained vast networks of sensors, listening stations, and human sources that fed into a constant assessment of enemy posture. But those networks had blind spots, enormous gaps in understanding that no technology could fill. The Americans could count missiles and decode radio chatter, yet they could not measure human fear. They could not see the exhaustion in the faces of Soviet officers, the sleepless paranoia of the Politburo, or the split-second hesitation of one man in a dark bunker outside Moscow. Intelligence could read data, but it could not read doubt. In 1983, the United States had its own anxieties. President Ronald Reagan had just labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire, and relations between the two powers had sunk to their lowest point in decades. The NATO exercise Able Archer 83 had pushed tensions to the brink, though most American planners dismissed Soviet alarm as posturing. The US had also begun deploying new Pershing II missiles in West Germany, capable of reaching Moscow in less than 10 minutes. Every strategic move from Washington was seen in the Kremlin as a potential first strike. And yet, inside the Pentagon, these developments were viewed through a lens of technological superiority, as proof that deterrence was working. The truth was more perilous. American intelligence analysts, armed with satellites and computers, had grown overconfident in their models of Soviet behavior. They believed the Kremlin would never launch a preemptive strike without clear, unmistakable evidence of attack. The idea that Soviet systems might generate false alarms, or that a single human decision could stand between peace and annihilation, never truly entered their calculations. To Washington, deterrence was a matter of doctrine, not emotion. The Americans assumed that the Soviets would think and act as they did, rationally, predictably, coldly. It was an assumption that might one day have killed them. For years after that September night, the incident remained buried behind Soviet walls of secrecy. No intercepted messages, no satellite photographs, no defectors spoke of it. The NSA had recorded a brief spike in Soviet military communications around midnight Moscow time, but the data seemed insignificant, just another anomaly in an era of constant alerts. Even when reports emerged months later of strange activity within the Soviet early warning network, they were dismissed as routine exercises. It would take a decade for anyone in the West to realize what had truly happened. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, its secrets began to seep out like light through cracks in a closed door. Former officers sold documents to foreign journalists. Retired generals spoke in cautious interviews, their loyalty to the vanished state fading with age. Among the fragments of revelation was a brief mention of a false missile launch warning in 1983, a story quickly dismissed by Western analysts as rumor. It wasn't until 1998, when a retired Soviet general named Yuri Votintsev gave a televised interview, that the full scope of the event came to light. Votintsev had been Petrov's direct superior at the time, commander of the early warning system. With a mixture of pride and melancholy, he revealed that the world had indeed come within minutes of nuclear war, and that a single lieutenant colonel had prevented it. Western audiences listened in disbelief. Governments scrambled to verify the claim, searching archives and intercept records. They found nothing, because nothing had happened. That was precisely the point. The world had survived an event that left no trace, no mushroom clouds, no documentation beyond a classified Soviet report written in the quiet horror of what might have been. The Soviet Union excelled at forgetting. It had perfected the art of burying mistakes beneath layers of bureaucracy, of turning errors into silences, and silences into state secrets. What could not be denied was erased, what could not be erased was renamed. The night of September 26, 1983, followed that same ritual of disappearance. Within a week, the official inquiry concluded that a transient malfunction in orbital sensors had caused the false alarm. There was no mention of panic in the bunker, no mention of Petrov's refusal to confirm launch, and certainly no admission that the world had almost ended. The report was filed, stamped top secret, and locked away in an archive whose very existence was classified. For the officers who had lived through the night, the silence felt like betrayal. They were ordered not to discuss it, even among themselves. Any record that named them was redacted or destroyed. At Sepukov 15, Petrov's shift log was quietly rewritten, its entries reduced to routine procedural language. The red emergency stamps were replaced with black ink, neat and forgettable. When Petrov asked about the investigation's findings, his superiors advised him to focus on future duties. The unspoken message was clear: the less he remembered, the safer he would be. In Moscow's Ministry of Defense, the cover-up had practical logic. Admitting that the Oko satellite network had nearly triggered a nuclear exchange would have undermined confidence in Soviet deterrence and invited scrutiny from the Politburo. The early warning system had been a triumph of propaganda, proof that socialism could match and surpass American technology. To reveal its flaws would mean acknowledging weakness, a sin far more dangerous than error. Senior engineers altered data, smoothed anomalies, and produced a new set of figures that made the false alarm look like a routine calibration glitch. The system, officially, had performed within acceptable parameters. Petrov was transferred to a research post in a remote division of the Air Defense Forces. His new assignment involved analyzing telemetry data from satellite tests, tedious work, safe work. His colleagues admired him quietly but kept their distance. The word disciplinary had appeared in his personnel file, an invisible scar that ensured he would never rise higher than his current rank. To complain would have been pointless. In the Soviet military, obedience was currency, doubt was debt. Petrov paid in silence. Years slipped by. He retired in 1984 after a mild breakdown, citing health reasons. Officially, he left on good terms. Unofficially, the system had dismissed him as an inconvenience. He lived with his wife, Raisa, in a small apartment in Fryazino, a grey suburb northeast of Moscow. They survived on his modest pension, repairing their aging car by hand and tending a small garden in the courtyard. Occasionally, former colleagues visited, bringing news of promotions, transfers, and deaths. None mentioned the night that had defined his life. It was as though it had never happened. But secrets have half-lives. In the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the walls of secrecy began to crack. Disillusioned officers, unpaid and unguarded, sold files to journalists or shared them with foreign researchers. Among the fragments that emerged was a brief technical note describing a false missile launch alert on the 26th of September, 1983, operator response, manual override. The note was buried in an appendix, but one name appeared in the margin, Lieutenant Colonel S.E. Petrov. The name caught the eye of a retired general, Yuri Votintsev, who had commanded the early warning system during the 1980s. In 1998, while giving a memoir interview to a small Russian newspaper, he mentioned Petrov's decision almost casually: "One of my officers prevented an accidental nuclear war." The remark should have vanished in print, but it did not. A Western journalist saw the article, traced the story, and found Petrov living quietly in Fryazino. The reporter arrived at his door one winter morning, notebook in hand, expecting to meet a myth. Instead, he found a thin, polite man in slippers who seemed bewildered that anyone still cared. Petrov told his story simply, without drama. "The alarm was wrong," he said. "I did nothing special." Yet as the details spread, the 5 Phantom missiles, the 23 minutes of uncertainty, the world began to realize how close it had come. International headlines hailed him as the man who saved the world. Television crews arrived, followed by documentary filmmakers and peace organizations. Invitations poured in from the United Nations, from European parliaments, from American think tanks. For the first time in his life, Petrov was asked to explain what it felt like to hold the fate of humanity in his hands. He always answered the same way: "I trusted my gut." nothing more. The sudden attention unsettled him. He disliked cameras, disliked being called a hero. Heroes act, he once told a reporter. I only refuse to act. The irony of his fame was that the state that had silenced him now sought to celebrate him, carefully, selectively, as proof of Soviet restraint. But Petrov declined most invitations. He accepted a few awards abroad, standing awkwardly on stage in borrowed suits, bowing his head as audiences applauded a man who never wanted recognition. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was a superpower in name but a hollow giant in practice. Its industries wheezed under inefficiency, its currency crumbled in silence, and its leaders, grey men in grey offices, mistook the echo of their own authority for stability. Yet deep within the military and intelligence apparatus, a quiet awareness had begun to take shape. The night of September 26, 1983, had changed something, even if it could never be publicly discussed. A single near war, invisible to history, had revealed the frailty of the empire's command over its own machinery. And though no one in the Kremlin dared speak the words aloud, the question lingered in private minds: what if next time, the man in the chair doesn't hesitate? When Andropov died in 1984, his short, paranoid tenure gave way to a succession of leaders too old to reform the system and too fearful to challenge it. But the unease remained, buried beneath the rhetoric of strength. The generals who had read Petrov's report now viewed their own technology with a trace of doubt. The engineers who had built the Oko satellites began redesigning systems with new redundancies, quietly adding human checkpoints into automated processes. For all their pride in Soviet science, they had learned that perfection was an illusion, and that even the most loyal machine could lie. The United States, meanwhile, marched forward in its confidence. Washington still believed that deterrence had worked, that peace had held because both sides were rational. President Reagan intensified the arms buildup, expanding nuclear deployments while pursuing the Strategic Defense Initiative, a project the Kremlin saw as madness disguised as strategy. The Americans called it Star Wars. To the Soviets, it was an insult to the fragile balance that had just barely spared humanity. Yet even as the missiles multiplied, something in the psychology of confrontation began to shift. Reagan, though fiercely anti-communist, had been shaken by the realization that nuclear war was not theoretical. In 1984, he watched The Day After, a grim American television film depicting a nuclear exchange in the Midwest. The realism unsettled him. He wrote in his diary that night, "It left me greatly depressed. We have to do all we can to see that there's never a nuclear war." He would later confess to aides that the film had changed his thinking. "We'd all be the victims," he said, "not the victors." Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet people were changing too, not through ideology, but through exhaustion. Years of scarcity, censorship, and fear had eroded the illusion of invincibility. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he inherited not an empire of confidence, but a system riddled with silent doubts, doubts that the Petrov incident had quietly amplified. He pushed reforms that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier: glasnost for openness, perestroika for restructuring. He began to speak of nuclear weapons not as shields but as chains. What few realized was how deeply that change of heart was rooted in unseen moments like Petrov's. Gorbachev later told American journalists that the 1983 war scare, triggered by the NATO exercise Able Archer and the Soviet false alarm, had left a permanent mark on him. "We were frightened," he admitted. "We had to change our way of thinking." The era of confrontation, he believed, had run its course. The logic of annihilation could no longer hold a world together. In 1986, the world saw that fear turn to action. Gorbachev met Reagan in Reykjavik, Iceland, for a summit that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. Behind closed doors, the two men spoke not like enemies but like survivors. They discussed total nuclear disarmament, not reductions, not limits, but abolition. The talks ultimately collapsed over the issue of missile defense, yet something irreversible had begun. Each side had glimpsed the abyss and decided, quietly, that it would not step closer again. Historians would later call Reykjavik the summit that failed but changed everything. Out of its ashes came the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first major arms agreement to eliminate entire classes of nuclear weapons. Over the next few years, verification teams from both nations would walk through each other's missile bases, Americans in the Ural Mountains, Soviets in the deserts of Nevada, and dismantle the devices that had defined their generation's terror. Cameras rolled, diplomats smiled, and the world exhaled, unaware of how much it owed to one anonymous officer's instinct on a September night. In the years that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, history reshaped itself with ruthless selectivity. Victories were remembered, failures were repackaged, and miracles, when they did not fit the new narrative, were quietly ignored. The story of the man who had stopped the end of the world did not find its place in textbooks or parades. For a long time, it existed only as rumor, a whispered anecdote among aging officers, a half-remembered story passed between intelligent veterans over vodka and smoke. The Cold War had produced countless soldiers, spies, and martyrs, but no category for a man whose greatest act was disobedience. Stanislav Petrov lived through those years in near obscurity. He occupied a one-room flat in Fryazino, a drab industrial suburb outside Moscow, where peeling wallpaper bore the marks of Soviet paint and the plumbing moaned through the winters. His wife, Raisa, grew ill, and much of his pension went toward her medicine. After she died in 1997, his world became quieter still. The neighbors knew him only as a retired officer who sometimes tinkered with old radios and fed the stray cats that prowled the courtyard. The children of the building called him Dedushka Stanislav, Grandpa Stanislav, without knowing that the old man with tired eyes had once stood between them and the end of everything. When the journalist from Germany first knocked on his door in the late 1990s, Petrov thought it was a mistake. "You are looking for someone else," he said at first, embarrassed by the attention. Only after the reporter showed him a photocopy of a declassified summary, incident the 26th of September, 83, officer, Lieutenant Colonel S.E. Petrov, did he nod quietly and agree to talk. His story spread quickly after that, first through small European newspapers, then through documentaries and think tank lectures in the West. The headlines were simple and dramatic, "The man who saved the world," but the man himself was not dramatic at all. When asked how he felt during the crisis, Petrov would shrug. "Scared," he said, "but mostly tired." He spoke little of ideology and nothing of heroism. He described his decision as an act of logic, not courage. "It didn't make sense," he said. "I thought, if America attacks, they will not send only 5 missiles. I knew the system could be wrong. Machines make mistakes." To him, that was all there was to say. Western nations showered him with belated recognition. The United Nations honored him in 2006 for averting a potential nuclear catastrophe. He received the World Citizen Award, the German Media Prize, and invitations to speak at peace conferences. He traveled reluctantly, bewildered by the attention. In New York, he stood beneath the glittering lights of Times Square and murmured, "All this for doing nothing." In Los Angeles, he was honored at a gala where celebrities applauded his calmness under pressure. He accepted the award with a faint smile and said, "I'm not a hero. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." The audience laughed softly, unaware that he meant it. For all the honors, Petrov never grew comfortable with fame. The spotlight reminded him of how close he had come to becoming the opposite of a hero, the man who destroyed the world. "If I had been wrong," he once told a journalist, "no one would be alive to tell this story." That thought haunted him far more than any celebration could erase. He lived his final years quietly, surviving on a modest pension that sometimes arrived late. The West remembered him with gratitude, but his own country did not. Russia's post-Soviet governments, wary of revisiting Cold War failures, offered no medal, no pension increase, no official acknowledgement. When asked about this, Petrov simply said, "They don't like to reward people who disobey orders." Visitors who made the pilgrimage to his small apartment found a man who carried no bitterness, only fatigue. The shelves behind his sofa were stacked with aging film reels, photographs, and fading letters from strangers who thanked him for saving their families, their futures, their lives. He never replied, not out of rudeness, but because he didn't know what to say. "What do you answer?" he asked once, to someone who says, "Thank you for existing." He spent his evenings watching old war films and tending to a small balcony garden. Sometimes he would look at the sky, at the stars that had once betrayed him, and mutter, "They are quiet tonight." He rarely spoke of politics, but when pressed, he would say, "The world has not changed. The weapons are still there. The computers are faster, the buttons smaller. The danger is the same." In 2017, Petrov died alone in his apartment, aged 77. His death went unnoticed for months, discovered only after a relative tried to call him and received no answer. The news broke quietly, a few lines on Russian wire services, a handful of Western obituaries. "The man who saved the world," they wrote, "has passed away." There were no state funerals, no honor guards, no speeches. Just a small ceremony, a simple coffin, and a scattering of friends and journalists who understood that history rarely remembers the ones who prevent disasters, only the ones who cause them. Time has dulled the memory of that night in 1983, but not its warning. The Cold War ended, its walls fell, and the world convinced itself that the danger had faded. Yet the weapons remain, quieter, smaller, smarter, and the systems that command them have only grown more complex. We live now in a world run by algorithms, satellites, and code, where decisions once made by men like Stanislav Petrov are increasingly made by machines. The same illusion that nearly destroyed the planet for decades ago endures, the belief that technology, in its precision, is infallible. In the years since Petrov's death, the archives of both East and West have slowly opened. We have learned how many times the world came close to the edge, how many false alarms, misread signals, and mechanical malfunctions nearly unleashed fire. In 1960, a US radar mistook the rising moon over Norway for a Soviet missile strike. In 1979, a training tape loaded by accident at NORAD triggered an alert that the Soviets had launched thousands of warheads. In 1995, long after the Cold War's end, a Norwegian weather rocket was mistaken by Russian radars for a nuclear missile, and the briefcase containing the Russian launch codes was opened for the first time in history. Each time, the crisis was diffused not by systems, but by people, tired, uncertain, fallible people who chose not to believe what their machines told them. The lesson seems clear, yet humanity has a talent for forgetting what frightens it. We build faster computers, longer-range missiles, and smaller, more autonomous weapons, each justified as deterrence. We speak of precision and control as if they were synonyms for safety. But every layer of automation, every generation of artificial decision-making brings us closer to the same fragile edge where a reflection on a cloud or a line of faulty code could once again summon catastrophe. The technology has changed, the margin for error has not. Petrov understood that long before the world did. His defiance was not ideological, it was moral. He saw through the illusion of certainty that defined his age, the belief that numbers and protocols could contain the chaos of human fear. His refusal to act was an act of faith in something deeper, that reason, intuition, and doubt still had value in a world obsessed with obedience. A person must always think, he once said. If you stop thinking, you stop being human. That truth is as urgent now as it was then. In an era of automated warfare and artificial intelligence, when decision cycles are measured in milliseconds and responsibility dissolves into algorithms, the question Petrov faced remains the same. When the system tells us to kill, will anyone have the courage to say no? Today, the story of that night is told in classrooms and documentaries, in speeches about ethics and technology. But for most of the world, it is little more than a curiosity, an anecdote from a war that no longer exists. The missiles, however, still wait in their silos. The satellites still orbit, their sensors watching for the flash of heat that could end all things. Somewhere, right now, another officer sits in another bunker, watching another screen, trusting that the signals stay silent. We have traded ideology for automation, but the risk remains unchanged. If this story moved you, explore the next chapter in our Cold War files, each episode uncovering the moments when human judgment, chance, and courage shaped the fate of the world. Subscribe and stay with us as we continue to explore the hidden history behind the balance of power, where one decision can decide everything.